Hi, everyone. This is Gail Axelrod, the Director of Marketing at OpenView. Thanks so much for joining today's webinar, all about how to craft your company story, really focused on messaging. So before we get started, just a quick background on OpenView. We are an expansion stage venture capital firm based in Boston. We invest all over the country and the world, really, and we provide a lot of operational support and content through webinar series like this, content on OpenView Labs, and other forums we hold throughout the year. So please take a look at our website, check out OpenView Labs, and we hope you find a lot of useful information there and in today's webinar. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the webinar, but if you have questions throughout, please use the chat feature on the left side of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible, both during the speaking portion and both in the Q&A at the end. And we'll send out the deck and recording in the next couple of days, so keep an eye out for that. Share it with your colleagues. We're hoping that not only you, but your team members will really find a lot of value in today's webinar. So to that end, we're going to get started. So basically, why did we decide to do a webinar on how to craft your company story? This is something that's near and dear to OpenView's heart. We actually went through a rebranding and repositioning, figuring out our messaging about 2 years ago with the help of Natasha Jen at Pentagram, one of today's panelists. So we know how hard it can be to really nail down your messaging, train your team, and make sure that you're speaking to your audience in the most effective way. So you know, we interact with dozens of companies every month, and we know that startups, both early, mid, and late stage, have a problem nailing their messaging. So we wanted to put together a really, truly expert panel to kind of help guide you through that. So I'll introduce our panel. Today we have Andy Raskin. He's a messaging and positioning strategist. He works with a ton of startups, big and small, that you've heard of. Natasha Jen, who I mentioned, is a partner at the world's largest branding agency, Pentagram, and Lauren Vaccarello, she is the VP of Marketing at Box, and they're truly an exemplar when it comes to messaging. So Andy, I'll let you kick it off, if you wouldn't mind kind of giving your background and then how you built a company story.
Sure. So I help CEOs and leadership teams get straight on their story, craft a strategic story that's going to power really everything they do, their marketing, sales, fundraising, even product management and recruiting. I tend to work with companies that are kind of in the mid to late stage startup phase, and I also do a lot of training on crafting the message for larger teams as well.
Great. Natasha?
Hi, I am a partner at Pentagram. We're a multidisciplinary design firm, but we craft brands. We craft brands from the inside out. We craft brands from a visual perspective as well as from a verbal perspective. That's where story falls in. We help companies to articulate, who they are, their mission, and we help them to really figure out how to express that to the external world.
And Lauren?
Hi, everybody. I'm Lauren Vaccarello. I'm the VP of Marketing at Box. So it's interesting. I come from a lot more on the in-house side, where from different companies, from the first time I really had kind of exposure and input to how do you build a story and how does your brand messaging, your company's story actually make you bigger than you are. I had spent time at Salesforce and really had that first taste of how you can be bigger once you really know what your position and what your story is. And then moved on to leading marketing at a startup called AdRoll. And that idea of what is your company story and how does that, again, elevate you? And how does, to what Natasha had said, both the visual side and the words on paper, how do you use the combination of that to elevate your brand? And when we were at AdRoll, it was how do we use our brand story? How do we use our message to move up market until you really appear bigger than we are? And then on Box, it's a little bit different. We're really looking at who being authentic to kind of our core and where we came from, but also using that brand story and our messaging to go to that next level and really embrace the cloud content management space. And how do we create this future state for us that continues to let us sort of grow at an accelerated pace?
Awesome, and that really brings me to my first question, and Lauren, you alluded to this a bit, but if each of you could go into more reasons on why really nailing down your messaging is important. I think with a lot of startups, they're so focused on, getting the product out there, building their product, building their team, that messaging can often fall by the wayside, and that's really, kind of putting all of that work for nothing if you can't sell it and, be really clear and concise. So I'd love to hear from all of you about why you think messaging is important for startups.
I can jump in and sort of talk a little bit on the earlier stage startup piece. It's really easy as a sort of a startup comes to be to think about where you focus. And I have a heavier performance marketing background, and I really started on the performance and demand gen side of, spend $1, get $10 back, and this is how you're going to grow and accelerate growth, which is extremely important, and I will never discount that. But this idea of starting with your brand story, starting with your messaging, and really knowing and identifying who you are early, who you are today, who you want your company to be tomorrow, and where you want to be in 5 or 10 years, and starting to plot that out. If you get that early and you start to get that idea early and get it right early, you'll be able to move a lot faster than the just pure transactional side on the performance piece, and you're going to be a lot more set up for long-term growth.
Yeah, I'll jump in next. I'd say that.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Natasha.
Totally agree. I think that for startups, it is so important to kind of really understand your own values and ethos and what's really driving the brand, what's really driving you to do what you do. And I think that figuring that part out and really, distill it in really clear articulation so that would become a foundational basis for the messaging and for the story. And that also, I think that would also would affect how you look, to the world. So, it is a kind of identity. We always call it kind of identity design system, just like a person. You have certain personality, about you, and you have their specific way to express yourself. And all these expressions really come down to your values. So, for a startup, I think it's so important to really articulate that, alongside with figuring out your product offering. I think the two, they really go hand in hand.
And I would add to that by saying I think that the story has always been important, but now even more so because I think a lot because of the emergence of social media and new kinds of distribution channels for the story. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, the story was told by the leadership team. Maybe you'd hire a PR firm to try to distribute it through some other channels, but now it's being told through everybody. And if the story is good, it's going to propagate. It's going to be retweeted and retold, and that just adds to the importance so much, to the point where you have big VCs like Bill Gurley coming out and saying, "Hey, listen, I'm looking when I see a founder pitch, I'm looking for their ability to tell the story because I know that's a competitive advantage, and because I know that if they can do it well, that's going to ultimately lead to a higher return."
Mm-hmm.
Great. And so how do you know if it's the right story? How do you test it? If you're a startup, you might not have a huge market to even go out to and ask if you're saying the right thing. So Andy, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, well, in one sense, I think, it's kind of like crafting a movie. There's some things that are good to test. Does this line work in this scene? But I think at a higher level, there's a kind of vision that the screenwriter or director has that, is probably beyond the realm of kind of A/B testing. That really has to be authentic and come from them. That said, one of the things that I always look to when I work with teams is I like to hear that when they're giving the story, particularly for B2B teams, if they're giving a sales pitch and they're starting to tell the story, you can almost see the body language of the prospects change, where they start not nodding and they start interrupting you and saying, yes, let me tell you how that's playing out here in our company. And once you start hearing that and getting that kind of feedback and that kind of engagement, I think deals are yours to lose, and there's a very good chance you're on the right track.
Natasha, anything to add?
Well, I think that there's a kind of risk that you have to take, that is to put the words out. There are different channels to do it, but there's really no other way to do it. But getting it out there and get people's feedback. And sometimes, it's not necessarily that the stories are not right. Sometimes it's a matter of, say, tone of voice that may not be right. So, you really have to get feedback in order to figure out, like, okay, how to precise, the story. I think tone of voice is a really big part of the brand identity, and that's something that needs to be defined, I think, before you kind of generate all the, communication tools or, pieces and put it out. But I think that's something that you really have to do it in order to test it.
Can you guys, I think it's really helpful to know what the right things are to do, but I think everyone is, finds experience really useful and learns from it. So Natasha, do you have, an example where you kind of made a mistake and you didn't tell the right story and how you pivoted from there?
Well, we're working on multiple brands at different stages simultaneously, and for some we would really redefine, a kind of, look and feel as well as messaging and tone of voice. For a brand that, we recently have worked on and we're still working, I cannot say what it is, but we did crafted a kind of tone of voice, attitude, and that is something that is more on the whimsical side when we feel that is appropriate for the company, and the company is actually a technology company, and we feel that, okay, there's a lot of whimsy to what I do, and there's a lot of, wit to the brand's DNA too. So we feel that, the kind of whimsical tonality in social media will be appropriate, and then we kind of, made it into a style guide, and then we gave it to, the agency of record, and they created, tweets over a period of time and put it out there. And the tweets, they all look really, really amazing, and there are a lot of really wonderful ideas, in the tweets. And they all point back to the company story, right? So everything seems right. However, it was the tonality of it. The voice felt a little too whimsical, and the whimsy was not so well perceived by the audience. And then we got feedback, so now we're kind of we're kind of looking at, okay, we still want to keep a level of playfulness, but we really have to look at the percentage of playfulness in the tonality, and that's what I mean by you have to put it out there and have audience to kind of live with it and receive feedback. So it's not necessarily like doing it right or wrong, but it's just a process of crafting it to what is the most precise. And I think that there's no such static thing as being being 100% precise because you're always evolving, right? But I think that it's really looking at the content that you put out there with the tone of voice at a particular given time and see how you can actually, craft things from that point on.
Great. And Lauren, have you guys kind of had any experience with, messaging that doesn't convert as well and going back and forth on that? How do you pivot to the right thing?
Hey, Trip, it's a great question. So I can actually tell you, going back a few years at Salesforce, we had a whole big company initiative around this idea of social enterprise, and we put a lot of time and energy and effort into this big brand campaign around the social enterprise, and it wasn't corporate philanthropy, but it was about the world is going social, business is going social, and how do you basically have this connected business? And the whole guise was this messaging of social enterprise, and it was the whole umbrella messaging. And we spent a lot of time and effort and energy across teams putting this together, doing this whole brand campaign messaging push around social enterprise. And when we put it in market, that exact phrase, that exact terminology didn't land as well as we thought it would. And there ended up being a lot of confusion in the nonprofit world, to which said, this is actually ours. We've been in this space for a while. The things that did work really well with it was the concept behind it of, businesses need to become more connected. And really pay more attention in that world. So what ended up happening was we ended up actually pulling core messaging, no longer using that phrase, and really turning it into this whole connected company push. The concepts behind it were good, but the word choice just didn't quite land. And what you need to do, especially as a marketer, is sometimes it looks great on paper, it looks great, and you can talk to a handful of customers and prospects to try to validate. But when you put it into market, the market will give you signs and signals, and if it doesn't work, know when to kind of cut and run early and know when to pivot, which is something that I remember when I was back at Salesforce we had to do.
Great. And Andy, since you're a consultant and you work with a lot of different companies, how do you really hone in, not being part of the day-to-day, so to speak, on what is going to make the company stand out?
Well, for me, this job of telling the story is really the CEO's job, and so I'm always looking to, when I get involved with a company, to understand that the CEO sees this as a priority and something that they're willing to put some energy into. I usually work with teams to define really 5 elements of the story. So, and these I outlined these in a post that you guys posted called "The Greatest Sales Tech I've Ever Seen," using Zuora as an example. But what is the big change in the world that's creating stakes for customers? What are those stakes? What's the promised land you want to deliver them to? What are the obstacles to that, and then how is your product going to or services or whatever you offer going to help folks get over those? And then finally, what's the evidence you can show that the story you're telling is going to come true? It's interesting to hear Lauren talk about the Salesforce campaign and the switch to that connected company. Some of the customer success videos that they did around that time, around the connected company, are the ones that I use to when I do training or work with clients, to show a great example of how even a customer success story, which works as that kind of evidence, can be structured along these lines. You look at some of the videos they did, like around one in particular with the CIO of Philips. He's basically going through all these elements. What's at stake for him? What's the promised land he wants to get to? And then Salesforce comes in positioned as to how they're doing that.
Really interesting. And I know you said this should really come from the top down, from the CEO. So to that end, how do you for each of you, and Lauren, probably start with you, how do you get your teams to buy into the story? And then beyond that, how do you ensure consistency in the story across your teams?
Sure. Good question. So it's funny, in the Salesforce example, it was actually a very, very tops-down, very tops-down sort of approach and way to do it. And it's so good to hear that what we had tried to build actually resonated and got pushed out. It's nice to get validation outside of the Insular world. And things that I've done in the past that have worked, especially when we're thinking about whether it's Salesforce or Box or my time at AgRoll, when we are thinking about not a rebrand, because sometimes rebrand can have loaded, be a little bit of a loaded phrase, but when we've thought about a lot of brand work that we've done, we've realized that if marketing does this in silo, it isn't authentic. And I've gone into organizations as, a newer head of marketing or a newer VP of marketing, and knowing that my perception on the brand, on our message, on where we should be, if, marketing creates or I created in silo, it is very, very inauthentic to who the brand is. So ways that we've helped get a lot of buy-in across the organization is obviously CEO alignment helps a ton, and if you have a CEO that really, really cares about brand, it makes things a lot easier. But pulling in who are the key influencers, who are the key executives across teams, and as you build your brand story, as you build your message, getting their point of view, getting their perspective, getting them involved, because the customer success organization has more contact in a day with customers than the marketing organization will likely have in an entire year. And the product organization will have a really strong perspective. The people team will have a really strong perspective. So it is, how do you get those lines of communication built up early? How do you make sure both executives as well as your sort of your individual contributor employees feel like they're part of this and they are part of the brand, part of the narrative, and they're part of the creation of it? I much prefer doing that than having these sort of strong reveals at the end of look what the marketing team built versus look at what we built together, and that makes it a lot easier to really show the brand across every single touch point.
Very cool. And Natasha, I know that when you were in the office and some of your colleagues from Pentagram, it was really about building a committee across OpenView and making sure that people from all departments were in that committee, and there was a lot of transparency. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think transparency is paramount in crafting a company story. I think that I'm all for getting everyone involved. I think that it's really a kind of collective process that I think that would first of all help the company come together. And I think once a company is together, you will have a much stronger point of view to speak to the outside. So when we were working with OpenView, OpenView is not tiny, but OpenView is a kind of mid-sized company of, very different expertise and, units, right? So what we want to do is to really get their point of views, on the culture of the company, but also to understand how they do things, a little bit differently from one another. But, surprisingly, we found out that everybody had more or less similar kind of experience with a company. So that told us one thing. That means that the company has a really strong culture. There's this kind of really open and can-do spirit that we see across the board, from the founder of the company to the front desk, for example. So that itself becomes a really important attribute to the brand. And, in that process, we kind of identify, okay, these are the 5 or 6, key attributes to OpenView. And these are really the foundational thing that has to be expressed, throughout all the touch points in every, in every story that we write, in kind of every expression that we do. So I think that, having everybody's input and being able to distill it into like a set of values, I think that itself is critical, for us and, for the work that we do.
Great. Andy, anything to add?
Yeah, in my engagements, I usually start with a team of the CEO, and then I ask the CEO to add maybe like 4 or 5 other people at most to start, so that we can sort of build the story with the key people that the CEO thinks should be involved. But this idea of then this group kind of builds the story, and very frequently I do, as others have mentioned here already, I like to ask, the company story is really, when it's done well, I think the customer story. What is it that the customer wants, and how are we going to get them there? And so in crafting the story, I think it's really important to talk to customers and ask them what are these elements of the story I mentioned for them. Very frequently, they'll put it in a way that the team just never thought to put it. They'll use words that we just never thought of. And I find that when taking the story then from that limited team out to the broader team and starting to socialize it and starting to introduce it, it's super helpful to include those customer voices as kind of the rationale behind why we did this. Because I think then people will tend to understand kind of where it's coming from. And a great example of that, I worked with a team. There's a team called Wootrick. They do customer feedback and NPS surveys, and we were looking for what I call this promised land message. What's going to be the top message and the new state, the future that we're going to create for customers. And we happened to see the LinkedIn profile of one of their customers, and he said, my mission is to win customers for life. And so we wound up going with that, which is a way of putting it that we had not put it before.
Awesome. So it takes so much work to really hone in on what the messaging should be, and then by the time you get everyone bought in and actually talking about what they're supposed to be talking about, maybe marketing is thinking, is our message still the right message? So each of you suggest that the people you work with deal with when should we change our message? How do we know if it's still working? What kind of A/B test do you suggest people run? Lauren, I'd love to hear from you.
Sure. I mean, that's always a tricky point of this messaging works great, but we've been running this for 4 years, and do we need to make updates and changes? Things that we've done, and a lot of this goes back to me really being kind of rooted in the performance marketing side, and then picking up brand later in my career, what are the results and what seems to be working? Are customers still paying attention? Is there still air coverage? Is this still the market? And a lot of it goes to, how does the message relate to the category that you're playing in? Has the category shifted? If the category has shifted, does your messaging also need to shift? And you'll start to see that in things like, are you winning the same number of deals? How does your win rate look? How does your market penetration and growth rate look? To start to see if your messaging, if the category is still relevant, if your messaging is still relevant to that category. And I also really am always in the sort of always be testing phase. This could be your core message, but do you need to tweak messaging based on new product features, new functionality, new categories, new target audiences you're going after? So there's plenty of places to test and try out and try this out, whether it's a Google search ad or a Facebook ad, or if you've got really close relationships with our customers. And Box is really, really fortunate to have very close relationships with our customers, and having those conversations with them of this is where you're going and evolving. And I don't know, especially in the technology space, the world moves very, very quickly, and you need to be prepared to move just as quickly.
Natasha, how do you deal with this when, oftentimes clients bring you on for a couple months or a year to really rebrand and reposition, and then what happens, in a couple years down the line? Do they re-engage? How do you guys handle that?
Yeah, we look at things from more from a qualitative point of view. Quantitative testing is really not our capability, but we tend to look at a company's offering product, right, is still true. But we also examine their values, I think that really, like I keep saying, is it really comes down to values. Have the values changed at all? Have the values evolved, has their mission evolved? Mission is supposed to be like a really timeless idea, but, sometimes a company's mission does evolve. So we'll look at these really fundamental things and really kind of see if what they're saying to the external world is still true to who they really are, what they really are. And sometimes, you would discover that, hey, this company has evolved quite a bit, but they're still kind of beating the same drumbeat as years ago. And clearly that is not the effective way to communicate, right, about themselves. So in that case, we will go in and then, really look at, again, tone of voice, messaging, and sometimes, identity too. Do we need to evolve the look and feel a little bit and to actually, reshape the organization and how it appears to the world a little bit. But, we look at it really from a qualitative point of view.
I'll second that, Natasha. Ben Horowitz, the partner of Andreessen Horowitz, said companies that don't have a clearly articulated story don't have a clear and well thought out strategy. The company story is the company strategy. I think this quote is profound in a lot of different ways. One of the implication is that when the strategy changes, the story has to change. One thing I'm interested in related to this around changing, I'm interested in. I noticed recently that Box changed the top line on its website. I forget what it said before, but now it says "work as one." I would call this the promised land message. What the future they're promising folks. And I'd be curious to hear from Lauren. What was a little bit of the background behind that and why that changed.
Sure. That's a great point. That is a very, very intentional change on our point and on our side. As Box has really evolved as a company, to your point, as we evolved as a company, our strategy and our messaging has to evolve with it. And we started more than a decade ago as something as basic as, file storage and cloud storage. And then we ended up moving to this enterprise file sync and share category with all of your secure file sharing. But again, as a company, we've evolved very, very, very dramatically and added a ton of new features, a ton of new functionality, and a lot of where we're going is this idea of cloud content management and how do you really put all of your work in one place and how do you work together across internal and external collaborators all in one place. And that really came up with this whole concept of work as one. And we really see that as the next evolution that we're on as a business and really wanting to take our customers on this and really showing our customers and our prospects that you can do so much with Box and there's so many possibilities, and it is not about just storing your files. It's about how you get work done. It's about how you get work done together through collaboration, through working with internal and external both employees and partners. And we really thought of what is the message that encapsulates that, how does that impact our brand, and using the homepage, which is prime real estate, as a place to really showcase this. We spent a lot of time going through the process of what the messaging is going to be. We have a product that delivers on it. We have this cloud content management category. But how do we really articulate and simply articulate our role in that and our position in it? And we spent a lot of time thinking through it, making sure we have a product to deliver on it, which thankfully we do, and then talking to our customers and spending time with our customers on what they want, what is authentic to them. And that really came up with this, work as one idea.
Awesome. Really interesting story, and I think Box, like I said at the top of the webinar, is just a really interesting company to follow in terms of messaging. So awesome to hear that from you, Lauren. So that concludes the panel session of the webinar, but we wanted to move into the Q&A portion. So again, use the left hand panel at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions. So I'll go ahead and get it started. First, we've gotten a few requests from people for actual blueprints or resources that kind of lays this out a little bit more tactically, so we'll definitely send those along when we send out the recording of the webinar, so don't worry, we got you covered there. And then, panel, I wanted to hear from you. People have asked, what do you guys think of the classic 25, 50, 100-word descriptions that so many startups rely on as like the Airbnb for X or the Uber for Y? So what do you think of these kind of taglines? Are they useful or are they more antiquated? And is there a better, more sophisticated way to do this? Andy?
Well, I always go back to, you're going to have to tell your company's story in lots of different formats. Like Lauren said, the homepage is one of those channels. You might have, if you're the CEO or you're supporting a CEO, your CEO might, you might get 15 minutes on a stage. And then there are those times where you have to tell it in 25 words or less. In my experience, it's good to have the same framework for all of these so that they're all kind of telling the same story. I think that the most important thing is to have this promised land message really clear, which is, what is the future? Not what is it that we offer? That's important too, but what is our customer's future going to be like thanks to having that thing? There are other pieces that are important too, but that's where I really come down on what's the most the key crucial thing.
Awesome. And then we had a question. Can you expand on story composition and red flags that people should stay away from?
Well, I'll jump in here. One pet peeve of mine is messages that kind of masquerade as promised land messages, but really don't say much. So this is stuff like transforming business, redefining finance, catering made better. These are like, yeah, they're okay. It's going to be different, but they're kind of punting on how. And I think if you do that, you're kind of punting on the story, and as people like Ben Hart saying, really punting on a well-defined strategy.
Really interesting. So it's all about using your story to help also define the strategy, which I think is really important. And that's kind of why messaging needs to exist. So to the next question, Lauren, you brought up at the top of the webinar that messaging can be used in a way to make companies appear bigger than they are, which can be helpful when you're trying to compete with the big guy in your space. So can you talk a little bit about the techniques or strategies that a company would use to appear bigger than they are?
Sure. It's both the combination of the sort of the messaging and then a lot of the visual. Things that we did at Adderall even specifically was so going back a few years and to a point that I believe Natasha made earlier with this sort of playfulness and wistfulness with one of her clients. Back when at Adderall in the earlier days, even something as simple as the logo was pink and blue and very cute and it was very cute as the only way to really, really describe it. And it really went too far in terms of how playful they're going to be. So it was how they updated the logo to make the logo a little bit more mature. And then the next phase, and I had to come in, was how do we look at all of our design elements and how do we make our design elements look a little bit more mature? How do we redefine our brand? Yes, we want to be fun, but what does fun really mean? And how do you get away from having this sort of more cutesy, childish look and feel to something that is a little more established, a little more trusted? And even if you see the current iterations of the Box brand from a pure design perspective, it still has a personality, but it is polished and mature, and it is very, very much in line with what our sort of core brand values and our core principles are. And what we had ended up doing from a very, very tactical perspective, both at Adderall and also at Box, is actually spent a real amount of time defining what are brand values, what are the values of our employees and what do we want that, but what are the values of the brand, what are the the words, how are we defining those words, and then how do we make sure the tone of our content lines up to that, the design really lines and ladders up to that, and how do you move away from the sort of more, and at Adwell it was the more kind of childish, very, very playful, to a little bit more mature, a little bit more established, changing the tone in a lot of what we did, changing out a lot of the word choices to really convey and push this more established brand. We also started bringing in as many proof points as we could from customers. Once you're lucky to get a couple of larger customers there, really touting the larger customers that we had and bringing them out front and center, everything from quotes on the website to how you, what customer logos you put on the website. So if you're putting customer logos on a website and you want to start appearing bigger than you are, and all of the customer logos are for very, very small, sort of unknown mom and pop shops, it looks like that's who your entire customer audience is. So how do you really spend that time cultivating large customer brand, building that up, and everywhere you can, starting to display that, and that'll start to make you look a little oversized and like you are a little more established playing in a bigger league.
Got it. Really interesting. And the last question we have here, Natasha, I'll give this one to you. How do the brands you work with, or how would a startup really, first of all, define the ROI of the work on the story and the message, and then not only that, but how do you really justify that to the leadership team that you're going to be spending a ton of time on this, maybe a lot of money? Like, how do you make sure that this is something the leadership team really is on board with and is okay with both time and money expenditures?
Well, we tend to provide in the conception and creation process. We always try to be as thoughtful as possible by kind of providing enough, examples. We're really about creating audience-facing examples to actually create this kind of landscape that you can understand, this is the totality of things. This feels cohesive. We create, this kind of evidence for anyone, leadership, or even for, staff who would have to execute this, to really understand that, okay, this is what I call a body of work, right? And I think that this body of work, of course, there's no data that actually says that it's going to be like a hit, home run. We don't know that, but there's enough, thoughtfulness behind it. And it's also, this kind of thing tends to be a process, right? It's not like you just do it very quickly. There's always months involved with, stakeholders, with, understanding macro trends, So by the time you get to this body of work, you're pretty sure that what you have here is already pretty crystallized. And we just try to create as many evidence, and examples as possible. For example, say, once we identify the key messages, we would then, really look at how it would be expressed, say, on a homepage, but then in social media, how would a tweet differ from, say, an Instagram post, when we're still talking about the same message and using the same voice. I think that this is something that a lot of companies, I think they're less sensitive to. It's just that, the messages can be the same. It's just that the way that it's expressed can be different. And I think that, once it's kind of what I call orchestra, it's well orchestrated, you will really kind of see the result. But it's like, how do we actually orchestrate it, and how much examples and evidence we need to create in order to actually understand, okay, this is going to be great. That's what we do.
One place that I see the ROI very frequently is sales cycle duration. I'll give you an example. Actually, Lauren's talk about a brand that was kind of trying to be fun reminded me of this too, because this is a company called 500 Friends. They do retail loyalty programs, and when I got involved there, the brand was very trying to be fun, but they had kind of pivoted so that instead of going after very small companies, they were starting to sign very large retailers. And so we changed the story to reflect that. And within about 3 to 6 months, we saw the sales cycle duration fall by half, meaning deals were taking, I think, 7 or 8 months, and we're then taking 3 or 4 months. And I think this was, of course, a lot of things are going on there, products getting better, all that, but I think we all attributed a lot to getting a little clearer on the story. And I hear that consistently. I think, a great story has ROI in lots of different places that are probably very hard or maybe even impossible to measure, but it's one place that I see it show up a lot.
Very good. Awesome. So that's all of the questions we have. So panelists, I want to kind of give you your last words, so to speak. Andy, do you have any last words on the topic for now?
Last words are get the story straight, because it's super important. It's important for fundraising, sales, marketing. It's really the most important tool you have for aligning your whole team around the strategy, powering towards success.
Great. And Natasha?
Be direct. People are smart, to treat them like smart people.
And Lauren?
Well, I think those are great pieces of advice. And then for me, it's really the industry and the markets that you're in are going to be fluid and fast growing, and make sure you know who you are as a brand, but it's also extensible enough that you can adapt to changing times. And I will tell you all that I am definitely a convert on this, and get your brand story right. Not even right, just get a brand story to start with as early as possible in your company life cycle, and be willing to dive in and revisit it and be willing to tweak it. But it's never too early to start really establishing who your brand is today, what your brand stands for, who you want to be, and the corresponding messaging. So start early.
Awesome. Really great advice, and we're really thankful for having the three of you to talk about this obviously really important topic for startups early to late stage. So thanks so much for your time today, and thanks to everyone in the audience for joining and for all of your great questions. So just to reiterate, we'll be sending out the deck and a recording over the next few days, along with some additional content pieces that'll give you more tactical information on how to build your story. If you have any questions that come up in the meantime, feel free to email me, editor@openviewpartners.com. And as always, stay tuned to our content. Look out on our website for upcoming events. And thanks so much again for joining. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.